Welcome. Today, we're jumping into one of the most talked about and honestly often misunderstood topics in the Bible: sex and marriage. What was the original game plan? What are the rules? And what might actually surprise you? All right, let's get into it. So, you hear all sorts of things, right? Was it really just about making babies? Is pleasure even a biblical idea? And how do you make sense of this one man, one woman thing when some of the most famous guys in the Bible had hundreds of wives? We're going to cut through the noise and get straight to the source to see what it actually says.
Before we can even talk about the rules, we've got to go back to the very beginning, to the original design. See, the Bible lays out this foundational blueprint for marriage right from the start. And it's the exact model that Jesus and the New Testament writers keep pointing back to over and over again.
And here it is, Genesis 2:24. This single verse is the absolute cornerstone, and you got to notice the super specific language: a man, his wife, and the two. This isn't just some poetic line. The Bible presents it as a clear three-step formula that sets the stage for everything else. Now, what's really fascinating here is the order of operations. First, you have to leave. You leave your original family to start a brand new primary unit. Second, you cleave, and that word means to make a covenant, a public, binding, I'm all in commitment to one person. And only then, after all that, do the two become one flesh through sex. The commitment is always designed to come before the intimacy. Okay, so if the blueprint is clearly for two people, that brings up a pretty big question, right? What on earth do we do with all those stories about men like David and Solomon having tons of wives? Well, this is where one of the most critical rules for understanding the Bible comes into play. You have to know the difference between what it describes and what it prescribes. And this is the key right here. Description is not prescription. Think about it. The Bible is a brutally honest book. It records the good, the bad, and the seriously messy parts of human history. It describes that polygamy happened, for sure, but it never, not once, prescribes it as God's ideal. Just because something is in the book doesn't mean it has God's stamp of approval. And man, this slide just hammers the point home. Look at the outcome column for every single recorded polygamous family. It is a consistent, predictable pattern of pain, jealousy, and total disaster. From Abraham all the way to Solomon, the text is showing us that straying from that two become one blueprint consistently led to chaos, not blessing. It's a description of human brokenness, plain and simple. And it's not like God was just being subtle about it either. Far from endorsing polygamy, the Bible has this explicit warning for Israel's future kings. So not only did God show the negative results through these stories, he actually straight up forbade the practice for leaders. And Solomon, with his 700 wives, becomes the ultimate poster child for what happens when you ignore this command. All right, so we've kind of settled the who of the blueprint: one man and one woman. So now let's dig into the why. This brings us to the purpose of sex inside that marriage. There's this really common misconception, even among religious people, that its only legitimate purpose is for making babies. But is that what the Bible actually teaches? Let's just tackle this one head on. If you've ever heard that sex in marriage is only for procreation, you are definitely not alone. But what's interesting is that this idea might actually have roots completely outside of the biblical text itself. The scriptures, when you look at them, paint a much broader, richer, and more colorful picture of its purpose. And boom, here's that bigger picture. Yeah, of course, reproduction is on the list. It's a huge deal. But look at everything else. The Bible talks about sex as a source of pleasure, as a way to deepen that one-flesh unity, to offer comfort, to protect a marriage from temptation, and as an act of mutual, selfless giving. It's a whole package. I mean, come on. It doesn't get much clearer or more passionate than this. This verse from Proverbs has nothing to do with procreation. It's a full-throated celebration of desire, satisfaction, and romantic intoxication within marriage. And that doesn't even get into the Song of Solomon, which is basically an entire book dedicated to celebrating desire and pleasure between a husband and wife. So if it didn't come from the Bible, where did this procreation-only idea even come from? Well, historians can trace it pretty clearly to the influence of certain Greek philosophies and later church traditions that were deeply suspicious of any kind of physical pleasure. It really seems to be an idea that was added to the Bible, not one that came from it. So if pleasure and intimacy are good, celebrated things, does that just mean anything goes between a husband and wife? Well, not quite. The Bible presents marriage as this amazing space of great sexual freedom, but it also builds some really important protective fences around it to make sure that freedom doesn't become harmful. This chart lays out those fences really clearly. On the forbidden side, the boundaries are firm. Nothing that brings in a third party, nothing abusive or coercive, nothing degrading, and, this is a big one, nothing that violates either person's conscience. But look at the permitted side. The principle is incredibly broad. Anything that is mutual, loving, consensual, and honoring to both of you is celebrated. Okay, now for the kind of specific question a lot of people have but are maybe a little hesitant to ask. Let's be real. The Bible isn't an explicit technical manual for the bedroom. So when it's silent on a specific act between a husband and wife, how is a couple supposed to figure out what's okay? For these areas where Scripture doesn't give us specific yes or no, it gives us something better, a framework of principles. It basically hands the decision back to the couple to be guided by these questions. Is it loving? Is it truly consensual with zero pressure? Does it cause any physical or emotional harm? And crucially, does it violate either person's conscience? If an act can pass all those tests, the Bible doesn't prohibit it. And this all leads us to the final, and maybe the most foundational piece of the entire puzzle. We've seen the blueprint, the boundaries, and the purposes. But why? Why is marriage the exclusive container for all of this? The answer is found in one powerful biblical idea: covenant. It all boils down to this. In the biblical worldview, sex is never just a physical act. It's understood as the physical sealing of a lifelong, public, covenantal bond. It's the one flesh reality that follows the cleaving commitment we talked about earlier. That's why it's treated with such significance, and that's why it's reserved for the covenant of marriage. The Apostle Paul makes this connection incredibly practical and down to earth. He totally acknowledges that passionate desire is a real and powerful human experience. But his solution isn't to just indulge it casually or pretend it doesn't exist. His instruction is direct. If you have that passion, the proper, God-designed path is to channel it into the commitment of marriage. And that leaves us with one final big thought to chew on. If you start to see sex not just as a temporary act of pleasure or biology, but as the physical sign and seal of a permanent, lifelong covenant, how does that fundamentally change its weight, its purpose, and its meaning? It's something to think about. Thanks so much for joining us.